terror off the edge. You know he's a big hitter and a run supporter. And in the passing game, he's a guy who's continuing to develop his passing game skills as far as being a one-on-one coverage defender. When he comes back, he'll definitely add a jolt to this football team and get them going again in the secondary.
All right, Mike, let's stay in the AFC East, where Jamal Adams used to play with Stephon Diggs, who is now a Bill.
Yeah, give him a B-. And he's had some really good production, 54 catches field. The reason it's a B- is when you're playing the game of chess as a GM, they had a lot of alternatives in the draft, and they could have taken Justin Jefferson, Ruggs, on and on and on, all these young productive receivers. So Diggs is a really good player. They gave up a lot of money and draft capital to get him.
All right, Lewis, you get to finish it off with the move that I thought was going to break Twitter when DeAndre Hopkins was traded to the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, this is an easy A+ for me. Got an up-close and personal look at DeAndre on Monday Night Football. And I'll just tell you this. This is a guy who's not only just productive in his own right, but for what he does for the rest of the receiving core and the offense as far as making opposing defenses dictate coverage and declare their intentions. He's having a trickle-down effect on the other wide receivers on that football team and for Kyler Murray, knowing that he can go to him when he needs to, as well as identify other targets in the passing game. And DeAndre's just a first-class teammate. I mean, he's just been a slam dunk for Cliff Kingsbury.
And the Cardinals, of course, able to get a long-term deal done with DeAndre Hopkins, which makes them very happy and very rich as well. Not quite sure we'd give the same grade to the Texans for their side of that deal, but they do headline the list of teams who could be active as we are about 30 minutes or so away from the NFL trade deadline. And Mort, what are you hearing about Houston right now?
Well, if Deshaun Watson was basically ready to get out of Houston when they traded DeAndre Hopkins. If they trade Will Fuller, he may go even with that big contract. And I'm kidding a little bit there. But, yeah, what the Texans have made known to other teams is that everybody on that roster is available except for Deshaun Watson and J.J. Watt. And teams have called. But the teams I've spoken with say they're asking for way too much for what they would even call a backup player. One backup player they want a third round for. So the price tag seems to be high, and I think it's in part because Jack Easterby, who's their acting GM now that Bill O'Brien no longer is employed there, is trying to get back some high picks. So those trades for the receivers, whether it's Will Fuller or Brandon Cooks or Kenny Stills or Randall Cobb, they've been asking too much. And I guarantee you, if they trade Fuller, Deshaun Watson's going to be one unhappy camper. As he said, he's not used to being 1-6, and he's still not throwing in the towel on this season, Mike.
Yeah, Mort, what's unusual about this situation is, of course, they like to recoup a couple of high picks if they can get it, but without a first and second round pick, it's not like by losing games they're incentivized from getting a better draft choice. They're trying to win as many games as possible coming down the stretch. So the feeling that a lot of people around the league have is they're going to stay pat despite the fact that they have the surplus at receiver. It's unusual because they're not trying to improve a draft choice for the future, which a lot of teams who are out of the race right now, that's what they're thinking.
This football team has, quite honestly, it's been poorly managed. It just really has from a roster building standpoint. And right now, these unrealistic expectations as far as what they think they can get in return for players who other teams are going to look at and go, well, there's no way we're going to value them that way because we haven't evaluated them at that level. It's just bad decisions beget bad decisions, and they just start compounding one another. And this is an organization that looks like it's going through a total teardown and rebuild with a quarterback who they just committed to long term, who's now has nobody left around him, where you can't even now highlight the player who you consider to be your franchise cornerstone. So it's a bad situation overall. And other teams aren't going to be ready to go ahead and help them out and help them, give them draft capital to make up for the bad decisions that they've made. So the Texans are in a bad spot going forward.
Well, sounds like they maybe undersold on DeAndre Hopkins, trying to oversell now on the remaining pieces. And Adam Schefter, we're now less than 30 minutes away from the NFL's 2020 trade deadline, keeping our hopes out for more action. And the Giants last night actually played a pretty competitive game against the Buccaneers, had a chance to tie the game late with a 2-point conversion, but they're still 1-7. Do you think that Joe Judge and company could be looking to make some moves here in the final minutes before the deadline?
Phil, I think the Giants were willing to listen on wide receiver Golden Tate, on offensive lineman Kevin Zeitler. I think they got calls on Evan Ingram. But the fact of the matter is they played Monday night, and that complicates things because one of the reasons that they'd be open to moving on from Zeitler is his salary. But any team that acquires Zeitler would want to adjust that salary. But you'd have to adjust that salary by 4 p.m. on Monday to make that trade happen by today's trade deadline, and they were playing last night. So the fact that the Giants were playing on Monday night, going into the trade deadline on Tuesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, I think limited them some in what they could and couldn't do in terms of making moves. I think that they might have gotten even more action on a player like Kevin Zeitler, but because of the timing of the schedule and the finances of his contract, that combination, it made it difficult for them to move on from Zeitler. I'm told it's quiet there right now. Look, anything could happen in these final 30 minutes. You never know. But they, I think, were willing to listen on Zeitler. They were willing to listen on Tate. But so far, to date, nothing has materialized.
Yeah, it's interesting conversation surrounding Kevin Zeitler, who last night, quite honestly, look, their offensive line looked pretty good against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And it already talked about the fact that Chicago is one of those teams that could really use some fortification at guard, particularly right guard, which is exactly where Kevin Zeitler lines up. What's interesting about their skill position players, when you're talking about Golden Tate and Evan Ingram, you know, it shocked me when I first heard about there being any kind of noise surrounding Evan Ingram and the Giants being willing to part ways with him, because this is a fantastically talented individual as far as being a movable chess piece as a weapon. And if you want to talk about the New England Patriots, who we're going to talk about, if I was calling anybody about anyone, both short and long term, it would be about a guy like Evan Ingram, because just think about what the Patriots have done with tight ends in the past and what they could do with a guy like Evan Ingram with his multi-positional versatility and his athletic ability in the future. So if I'm the Giants, I'm holding on to Evan Ingram. I'm trying to figure out a way to get him more involved in this offense. But if I'm a team that's now, has some news saying the Giants could be sellers, that's the one guy I would call on.
Yeah, I agree with Lewis. I'm keeping Evan Ingram. If I'm the Giants, I'm pouring all the resources possible to get all that talent out of him and make him a more consistent player. The player that makes sense to trade there is Golden Tate, 32 years old, 2 more years left on his contract at reasonable numbers. So if I'm the Giants, I have Slayton, who's young, Sterling Shepard, who's young. Golden Tate's a guy that's probably not part of the future. So if I could get a draft choice for him, that was somebody I would try to trade here in the next half hour. But beyond that, I'm holding serve on the Giants and try and keep as many of these young, talented players that I have.
Maybe we can get Daniel Jones pick things up a little bit as well after some disappointing turnovers last night. Now, Diana, you would not realize it based off how they played on Sunday when they took care of business against the Packers, but the Vikings have been so disappointing so far this year. Any chance they could be sellers in the closing minutes here before the NFL trade deadline?
I know I really expected them to make a lot more moves before this deadline here as it inches a little closer. There have been a lot of players that they've talked to teams about. Tight end Kyle Rudolph being one of them. Safety Anthony Harris has been discussed with a few teams. From what I was told, though, there wasn't a team that they could strike a deal with. Wide receiver Tajay Sharp, another player that the Vikings were willing to deal. Riley Reif as well. Probably the biggest name in terms of rumor, wide receiver Adam Thielen, and I've been told over and over and over again, they weren't even open to listening to deal Adam Thielen. But at this point, a team that I really thought would make a move before this deadline hasn't as of right now.
Yeah, that's right, Diana. There was a lot of talk that the Vikings may have a fire sale, and then they traded Yannick Ngakoue to the Baltimore Ravens. But, they may have a couple things, and you mentioned Kyle Rudolph, the tight end. But, in the offseason, Mike Zimmer, the head coach, he was offered an extension, but he wanted a longer extension, and eventually held out till he got one through 2023, because I think he saw that this team needed some parts. They were going to have some salary cap issues and still needed to rebuild the roster. And, of course, Danielle Hunter's season-ending injury didn't help them. But I would say, like Phil said, the way they played against the Packers, you wouldn't know that was a team that might actually sell off some players right now.
Yeah, and of all the teams that were impacted by COVID, I think the Vikings may be at the very, very top of the list. And here's why. They lost their top 3 corners a year ago. They have about 7 players on defense, either starting or playing meaningful snaps, that are rookies. So all that time that they didn't have, they had 2 first-round picks that trying to acclimate in both offense and defense. And when you think about crowd noise and home field advantage, I think about Seattle, Baltimore, and Minnesota as the top 3. So there's a lot of reasons why they're struggling, but when you have to integrate and replace your 3 top corners, it's hard to get them ready. And we saw what happened on opening day against Aaron Rodgers. So I expect this team to continue to improve, and I'd be surprised if we saw them move on from any other veteran in